Hey friends, it's Laura with Laura's Handmade Haven. Welcome or welcome back. I'm so glad you joined me today. So I just posted this little short on my channel not too long ago, and it was actually about this quilt. Basically, I had a whole bunch of scraps left over from a Basic Grey decorum line, and then I also had some scraps left over just from some other quilt projects I had worked on. In fact, this main fabric here was backing fabric. It was like a wide back that I used on a different quilt. And this polka dot print was one that I used in a couple different quilts that I had. And I actually purchased the wide backing fabric for that and used it on the front of a quilt and the back of a quilt. And I really love those large polka dots. But I had all those scraps left over. And then I was like, what am I going to do with that? So what I did was I just sewed all the scraps together into basically units, strip set units, and then I cut them down into a uniform block size and created my bear paw blocks to turn it into a pretty large quilt. It ended up being about 75 square. And that video, that little short, got a lot of views in a short amount of time. And I thought, I'm thinking people might be looking for some ideas of what to do with scraps. So I also pulled out some selvages that I've had in the stash for a while. I had some Basic Grey Grunge fabrics that I love the grunge fabric so much. And so I had saved all the selvages with the idea that I would do something with them. So today what I'd like to show you is what I'm going to start doing my next scrappy quilt, building upon a string block type feel and using up all those selvage edges, but you could do the same exact thing with any kind of scraps you have. So we're just going to need a few supplies before we get started. So gather this up. You're going to need some interfacing, and it doesn't really matter the weight. A lighter weight interfacing would be good. I typically do use like a featherweight, a Pellon featherweight interfacing weight for this idea. So we're going to do some foundation string block piecing. And then we're going to end up with blocks that look kind of like this. This is a very easy and quick thing. This is going to be like some mindless sewing. I'm going to give you a few tips on how you can like make it faster for yourself, how you can like kind of have these things sitting off in the wings. And then as you have time or you have a few minutes that you just want to sit down and sew something quick just to get your mind off of other things, this would be a great project to grab because you can build as you go. You could use one collection, you could use multiple collections, you could do whatever you wanted with it. It could definitely be very organized or it can be very organic. So I'm going to show you what I've gathered together and how you get started making these blocks. And then I'm going to give you a few ideas of what you can do with them after they're made. I'm not going to show you any quilt tops today, but that will be coming in a later video. So without further ado, let's head on over to the sewing machine and I'll talk you through what you need to get started. All right, so at the sewing machine, this is what I've gathered together. I have some Pellon squares. They're cut to 10 inches. And the reason I do 10 inches is because interfacing comes in 20-inch wide increments, right? So if you get yardage of interfacing, it's going to be 20 inches by however long, however much you purchase. And I cut them into 10-inch squares because that's really easy to do. You just cut right down the middle of your interfacing, cut them into 10-inch squares, and then you can cut that down to a 9.5-inch square. You can leave them at 10. You can do whatever you want with that size, or you can cut them into 5-inch squares even. But whatever, I start with 10-inch squares of my interfacing, and that's just so I can maximize the use of my interfacing when I get it in yardage. Now, you're also welcome to leave it at the 20-inch wide. I just found that working with 10 inches is as much as I want to take on at a time. So just kind of give that a little thought and maybe try it out both ways and decide what you like and what works best for you. So the other thing I have in my pile beside my machine is just a whole bunch of these selvages. Now, I'm using selvages today, but you could use any type of scraps that you want. You could also use jelly rolls. You could use the little honey buns. You could use whatever you want, just scraps. And I know that there are some of my friends that they just keep a basket of scraps by their machine, and then when they have time, this is what they do with their string block construction as well. So I'm using selvages today. So I have a whole bunch of the Basic Grey Grunge selvages. This is actually off of a fat quarter bundle that I had. And then I also have some of those polka dots. This is also a Moda Grunge. It's part of the, I'm not sure. Let's see if, well, you know what? It is a selvage. So let's see if it tells us. This is Grunge Hits the Spot. Tells us right there. Doop-a-doop. So I have a bunch of this, and then I have a whole bunch of the red, and I just have a plethora of selvages to play with here. So basically what I'm going to do is take one of my pieces of interfacing and just start at a corner and start building out my strips across. Now, since I'm using selvages, one of my edges is going to show. So because this edge is it's not going to fray, it's not going to cause me any problems. So I can just run my seam down that and just build them as I go across my piece of Pellon. Now, if you're using scraps, you want to make sure you're going to do your blocks a little differently. Instead of building them on top of one another, which I'll point out when we're sewing, you would actually flip them back and do right sides together and keep building out. And I would recommend you going from the middle out if you're doing scraps, but since I'm doing selvages, I'm going to do from corner to corner. Just to get started with my selvage string block construction, I'm going to start with one of my red pieces because it's a little wider than my other selvages are. And I'm just going to put it across the corner up here. And then I am going to just find another piece. And it just happens that I have this piece that I cut off of. Actually, that's not big enough. So we're going to wait. We'll save that for the other end. It happens, so it's fine. I kind of like maximizing my scraps a little bit. So I know that that's going to fit pretty well down here. And I'm going to use with red right there. All right, so I'm going to grab one of these polka dots. Now, I will admit that this is a little tricky until you get going. And once you get a rhythm going with this, then it's definitely a lot easier. So just give yourself a little patience and grace, just like you would do any of your friends. And then I'm just going to sew about 1/8 of an inch away from the bottom edge of my selvage, making sure that I'm in the fabric, not just the little fraying part, but in the actual fabric. And I'm just going to cut that off because I'll use it again. And then let's see what else we can find. Maybe we'll start a new strip. Yep. All right. So now we're going to take this one and flip it up, and it's going to go over the raw edge of the next selvage that I'm putting on there, just like this. And again, I'm using a 1/4 inch piecing foot, and inside of my foot, there's a little line, a little indentation, I guess. And it's basically 1/8 of an inch, and that's what I'm going to kind of use as a guide on the edge of my selvage. Just go across there. And then I can just scoot this one up just a smidgen. And we'll do the same thing for it. Now, when I have a selvage that has like this red thread in it, I kind of tend to follow that and do my stitching line right there because I know that's a good stitching place. It was good for them. It was good for me. Now, I will go ahead and cut these off. I'm not too worried because remember, these are selvages. These are scraps to begin with. So if I lose a little bit or whatever, it's going to be okay, I promise. This is just such a fun little project to do just because you get to see all the different selvages, all the prints they put on the edges of the fabric. Some of the time, depending on how big of a selvage you allowed yourself to cut, sometimes you will be able to see a little bit of the fabric peeking through there, sometimes not. Like with my black, I kind of cut that a little narrower than I should have. So I don't get to really see too much of that black grunge, but it's okay. I'm fine with that too. And again, we'll put another piece of red in here because I do have a lot of this red. The red grunge that I have, I used it to make a MG quilt for my husband for our car shows and such. So I had quite a few yards of that red. And so I have quite a few lengths of selvage on that red because I was so smart and I cut the selvage off that fabric before I started building the quilt. So I have a whole bunch of red that I can use and put into these blocks. Now let's see if this happens to be, oh yay, it is. This polka dot is long enough to go from corner to corner. Make sure we move it up just a smidge. I like how those little polka dots will still kind of peek out, but yet they're still hidden underneath. A little bit. They're a little shy, I guess. All right, so now at this point, I'm in the middle of my block, so I'm going to turn it around. Now, if you are using true scraps that are not selvages, you would not build it this way. You would take your scrap and you would go right sides together like this, and you would do your 1/4 inch seam, and then you would flip it over and put your next scrap on top of it and do the same thing. Another piece on top, right sides together, 1/4 inch seam, and keep building out. And that's why I said I would suggest that you start in the middle and start building out from the center out of your block if you're doing diagonals like this, because that way you will be able to make sure that you have all of those raw edges hidden all the way across the block. Now, since I am doing the true selvages, I will just be going from corner to corner on my blocks, which is also fun. Now, this one, I did not really leave much of the fabric above the selvage, so it's going to be a little tight, but we'll make it work. And it doesn't really matter. It just means that not much of the fabric is showing. It just has more of the selvage and not as much of the fabric. Let's see, that one's not quite long enough. Thankfully, we have a pile of selvages over here to grab from. This is such, like I said, this is such a fun, mindless project to do. I mean, there's a little bit of thought into it, obviously, but it's not like you have to, you're not cutting things in advance, really. You're just putting them on here and building them out and just having a little fun. I think that that's so important, to have some fun in the craft room. So many times we take on all of these big projects and we take everything so seriously, and everything has to be so precise in quilting, and then we get so burnt out. Maybe I'm the only one that does that. I don't know. Do you get burnt out on your crafting because you've been working on something so serious and so strenuous for so long, and then you're just like, I just want to play. That's all I want to do. I had told my husband a few weekends ago, I was working on a product review actually, and it really caused me to think outside the box and really kind of think about what I could do and be creative. And I got out some supplies that I hadn't used in years and just had a good time playing in the craft room. And that is so important to do sometimes. I think it just like builds your creativity. Those of you that have been watching my channel for a while, you know that I'm working on a master's in learning technologies and design. And I've really been learning a lot, and it's been so fun to just kind of bring some of the courses that I had taken as part of my undergrad into the master's program. And one of the things that I've been kind of focusing a lot of my work on is just positive psychology and learning how the just the ability to be creative and the arts and crafts that we partake in, how that can help build a lot of positive mental health benefits, just building some resilience and grit, and also just building up your overall well-being, just being creative. All right, so now we're going to take this over to the cutting mat, and I'm going to show you how to trim these down, and we'll see what our final block truly looks like, even though we have a pretty good idea right now. Okay, so here's what our block kind of looks like with all of its little strings hanging out everywhere. We're just going to flip it over to the back side, and this is where that nice interfacing block comes into play, because now all we have to do is take our ruler and trim it down. Now, most of these scraps are too small to save. At least I think so. If you want to save them for another block, please feel free to do so. I feel like these are all a little too small to actually deal with on another block, so I'm going to toss all those into the trash can. And again, I'm just laying my ruler on the edge of the pellon interfacing and just trimming down to match that line. So I know that when I have this trimmed down, I'm going to have a 10-inch square. Now with all these extra strips, now this one might be okay. I'll put it to the side. I may use it, but these are all too small, but these are not. So this will go back into the pile and go back into the mix, and we'll be able to use it on another block. All right, so here's our finished block. Now I could use this just as it is in something, or I could cut it down to smaller 5-inch squares, or maybe I just want to make sure that maybe I have a block that I want this to be the center. Let's say we're working on a star block, and I can cut this down to maybe it needs to be a 6.5 or a 9.5 or whatever it needs to be. I have a 10-inch square to begin with that is ready to go, and it can become part of a larger block, or it can be a block on its own. And that kind of that decision is to be determined, because all I'm going to worry about right now is creating my string blocks with my selvages. All right, so now I have 3 of my selvage string blocks to play with. I'm going to continue making these blocks until I have a pretty good pile, and then I will decide what I want to turn them into. So right now, all I know is that these are going to be something in a quilt or a table runner or a bag or something. But all I'm worried about today is just creating these selvage string blocks and having them in a pile for me to pull from when I decide what the larger project's going to be. And that's kind of what happened with this quilt. And let me back you up a little bit so I can kind of talk through that a little bit too. So with this one, what I did, and these do not have interfacing in them because they're all straight lines, and I don't really feel like I needed to do that with straight sewing if they're not at a diagonal, because they're not going to skew. You're not on a bias, so it's not going to shift and skew on you. So those I just sewed right next to one another and then cut them down into the square sizes that I needed. And then once I had the 16 string blocks together, then I was like, what am I going to do with these? And I honestly grabbed one of my quilting books and I flipped through until I found a block that I thought, ooh, I like that block. It was not the same size as these on the wall. It was a total different size, but I could take that string block and then calculate the square sizes that I needed for the half square triangles and the borders and the sashing and all of that. But I had a base to go from, and I was like, okay, I want to take my string blocks, and instead of having just a plain Jane center on this bear paw block, I'm going to put my string blocks there and build those bear paws out. So that's exactly what I did. So that's what I would encourage you to do. Once you have your string blocks made, then flip through some of your quilt books or go online and look up some quilt blocks and decide, oh, well, look at that. That is a square that I can be working with. And right now, maybe it's shown as a solid square, and maybe I don't want a solid square. So I'm going to put a string block in its place. And that's what is so fun about string blocks, is that you can replace solid squares with a string block, and it completely changes the look and feel of any quilt block that you're making. So I encourage you to play with your scraps. Keep those scraps, play with them, build yourself some string blocks. You can either do straight string blocks like these. You can go on a diagonal like those selvage blocks that I showed you today. You can use selvages. You can use scraps. You can use jelly rolls. You can start with whatever you want and then just build out some string blocks and then decide, what am I going to do with those? Allow yourself that creative freedom. Allow yourself to play in your craft room and allow yourself to bring the joy back into your crafting. Until next time, I hope you find joy in all you do. Carve out some time for crafting and creating. And remember, it's always better when you make stuff up.